Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Welcome to this panel discussion, Faith and Freedom, a Lithuanian Perspective. This panel is hosted by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, in partnership with the Embassy of Lithuania to the United States, the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. I am Jerry Powers. I am Director of Catholic Peacebuilding Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies of the Keough School at Notre Dame. In March 1987, I joined the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference and was assigned to work on what were seen as two hopeless causes: nuclear disarmament and religious freedom in the Soviet bloc. If, when I arrived, I had given a talk in Washington and said that within 3 years, Lithuania would declare independence, and within 4, the Soviet Union would cease to exist, I would have been fired for being hopelessly naive and just plain wacky. Prone to confuse the Baltics and the Balkans, I was fortunate at that time to be tutored by Father Kazimir Puikevičius, Victor Nakas, and Ginta Demušis, and other extremely patient members of the Lithuanian Catholic Religious Aid and its Information Center in New York. Lithuanian Catholic Religious Aid disseminated the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Lithuania in the West. We worked together on religious freedom, and in the summer of 1990, organized a delegation of bishops and foundation heads led by Cardinal Joseph Bernardine of Chicago that visited Lithuania, Russia, and Belarus. This webinar is about one important part of that remarkable story of the demise of Soviet communism and the repression of religion that was its calling card. The Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Lithuania was first published 50 years ago and became the longest running samizdat publication in the Soviet Union. At the risk of imprisonment and other penalties, for 17 years, Catholic priests and nuns used the Chronicle to document religious persecution and other human rights violations. 81 issues were produced clandestinely, smuggled out of the country and published abroad, reaching a wide audience among governments, the churches, media like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, Radio Vatican, and human rights organizations. This webinar is part of a year-long commemoration of the Chronicle by the church, government, and civil society in Lithuania. This commemoration is partly about history and remembrance, understanding the role of the Catholic resistance to Soviet repression and the contribution it made to the human rights movement of its day. But it's not just about the past, it's also about what we can learn from the Chronicle's important role that might have lessons for us today. And we are fortunate to have 5 distinguished discussants with us today. Each will offer some opening remarks of about 5 minutes, and then we will have a discussion and entertain questions from the audience. I will introduce each of them before they speak. To begin, since 2019, Dovydas Špokauskas has been Deputy Chief of Mission for the Lithuanian Embassy to the United States. Prior to his posting to Washington, he was Foreign Policy Advisor to the President of Lithuania. He will address why the Lithuanian Parliament has declared 2022 the year of the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Lithuania. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Powers. Dear participants, it is indeed my honor to introduce this event on behalf of the Lithuanian Embassy. And let me first thank the Nanovic Institute for European Studies at the University of Notre Dame, the Catholic Peace Building Network, and the Catholic University, with whom we have a pleasure to partner, as well as for this really distinguished panel from which we are all so much eager to hear. And finally, special thanks to Ambassador Ginte Damušis, who is a real engine behind this event. 50 years ago, the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Lithuania was first published and started its 17-year-long mission to shine the light on the crimes and human rights abuses of Soviet regime, as well as violations of religious freedom. And although today Lithuania has since regained its independence and is now a country where human rights, including religious freedoms, are respected and protected, the lessons of the Chronicle remain just as relevant to this day. The story of the Chronicle teaches us the power of truth. It teaches us that even in the darkest hour, we must never stop documenting the truth, because eventually there will come a time for accountability. There will come a time for justice. And today, in the face of Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, we see firsthand how shining the light on the facts can help rally the world in defense of freedom. The means today are different, and modern technology gives us an almost instant view of crimes and abuse. Yet the parallels with the Chronicle are evident. Just as then, we need to document human rights violations and make sure not only that we retain the record of truth for the future, but also that this truth reaches the widest possible audience. Sadly, in Russia, we now see a seemingly unstoppable return to those dark days when speaking out about your thoughts, about your beliefs, about your values could not only cost you your freedom, but could sometimes cost you your life. And these days, the human rights organizations such as Memorial that aimed to record these crimes against humanity and abuse are being crushed by the Putin regime. Yet, as difficult as it may seem, the history of the Chronicle should provide us with a ray of hope. Since while there might be times when our fight might seem hopeless and with no end in sight, it is absolutely crucial for us to have those kinds of people whom we had in the times when the Chronicle was produced. Like the nuns, like the priests, like others who've gathered information of abuse, like those in the network of people who printed and disseminated the Chronicle, like those volunteers who risked bringing the copies of the Chronicle to the West, and of course, those dedicated people in the Lithuanian diaspora who made sure that all this information reached every US congressman, sat in the libraries, and was broadcast for all to hear. And all these people with their little chisels, continued to chip away the monument of lies that was the Soviet Union. And eventually, that monument inevitably collapsed. So today, 50 years on, my generation and next generations owe these people our gratitude. We owe them their remembrance, and we owe them our freedom. So thank you very much. And I look forward for a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you very much. We now have Archbishop Cantarus, Grucius, who has been Archbishop of Vilnius since 2013, the former president of the Lithuanian Bishops' Conference. In September of 2021, he was elected president of the Council of European Bishops' Conferences, which covers all of the bishops' conferences of Europe, East and West. Jesus assures us that truth will set us free, and Mr. Spalkauskas just talked about chipping away at the monument of lies. Jesus also reminds us that the cost of discipleship can be very severe. The cost of speaking truth to power can be serious. Archbishop Grucius will reflect on the Chronicle as an expression of Catholic faith.
Thank you very much, Jerry. In fact, the whole movement of the Chronicle is based on, as already was said by Dovydas, and as you mentioned, the line from the Gospel of John, that the truth will set you free. And the basic belief in this tenet is what was behind the whole movement. But it also highlighted the fact that there is a cost of speaking truth to power, a cost of discipleship, as Bonhoeffer would say. It all really started with a group of priests who, seeing what was happening in Lithuania, that the government was trying to slowly close the last seminary. They had allowed one to remain open in Kaunas, and there were limited the people who, the numbers that would be allowed to enter, which were significantly lower than the number of priests that were dying each year. So by attrition, they were trying to eliminate the number of priests in the country. And a group of young priests decided to write to the government and to demand that more young men would be allowed to enter the seminary. From this later developed the idea of chronicling or fixing down the various abuses that were taking place. The Soviet Constitution declared a freedom of religion, and so when the freedom was trying to be practiced and people were punished for it, they logged it into this chronicle. It had a variety of these examples, whether it would be priests that were punished for catechizing children, preparing them for sacraments, or priests that would be punished for having a procession publicly. One of the examples that was very beautiful is now Cardinal Tamkevičius, who was a priest of only 10 years of service when the Chronicles began, published in the Chronicles a letter from him from prison when he was in the gulags in Siberia. And in the letter, he reflects and writes that if God wants me, has put me here, that must be his will, and I must be of more service to the church and to his mission by being detained in Siberia. The group of priests, another group, including Tamkevičius, formed the Catholic Committee for the Defense of Believers' Rights. And all of these things really just, as was said, become very pertinent for us today. We see that lies have to be enforced by force and brutality. We see that in the Ukraine. We see that in the history of which writes the Chronicle. We see that truth, on the other hand, requires sacrifice and a very determined standing in the truth. The information and disinformation, getting the message out. We see the parallels of what's going on in Russia with the amount of information they're getting about the Ukraine. But it is a great example, and we saw it in the scriptures in the early days of the church, Paul's sufferings and trials in trying to get the message out, and what it cost him and what it cost these various priests and religious and lay people who were ready to sacrifice for the truth. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, when he was here in 2018, one of the places that he visited was the KGB prison, which is in the heart of town, now a museum, where many of these priests, religious, were brought in for questioning, kept in prison. Earlier on, there were executions there. We had a bishop who was executed there, and it really shook Pope Francis. It was the image that he took back with him to Rome, and on various occasions he has commented of how forceful that is. It was after that visit that he actually named Sigitas Tamkevičius a cardinal. And I believe it was very much for the efforts of what he had done in the past, of bearing the hardship, proclaiming the truth, and really preparing the way for Lithuanian independence and freedom.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. We now have Professor Arūnas Streikas, who is director of the Department of Contemporary History at the University of Vilnius. He will remark on why the unarmed resistance in Lithuania in the 1970s and 1980s focused on believers' rights and the broader impact it had on the other human rights movements of the era. Welcome.
Thank you for the presentation, and good morning for those who are watching to us in USA. Yes, I would like in my short presentation to address maybe only very briefly some points why the Catholic resistance in Lithuania during the late Soviet period was so visible and was maybe most visible among other groups of dissent, and later on to explore a bit about the impact of the Chronicle on the general process of society's emancipation and liberation at the end. So answering the first question, I would point out maybe 3 or 4 aspects. First of all, Catholic Church was visible in the face of almost total silence of other actors who could take this role. I mean by that intellectuals, academicians, as it was in Soviet Russia, or labor people, as it was in Poland. Secondly, in spite of efforts of the Soviet regime to subdue Catholic Church, to convert it into the tool of Soviet power, similarly as it was with Russian Orthodox Church. Catholic Church remained, at least partially, remained an autonomous institution, one of maybe the only autonomous institution in the Soviet system in Lithuania. Thirdly, practicing Catholics, be it priests, be it religious people or lay people, they had maybe the least to lose in the Soviet system because they couldn't occupy better positions in Soviet system to acquire better jobs. And on the other hand, they could hope that their voice will be heard in the world because they were the part of Roman Catholic Church, Universal Catholic Church. And at last, I would mention that those social ties of confidence which existed among religious communities in the Soviet system were a rare exception in atomized Soviet society, Soviet system, and so constituted the base for activities against the regime. Now, if we address the second question about the influence of Catholic resistance in Lithuanian Chronicle for the emancipation of the society, I would begin with the statement that the Chronicle was instrumental in breaking monopoly of information, which was maybe the main source of regime strength before that. Secondly, the ability of the Chronicle to withstand the pressure of Soviet repressive bodies and to continue its activities more than a decade emboldened the society, and especially those people who maybe thought about joining more active resistance. On the other hand, the names of regime's collaborators which appeared on the pages of the Chronicle, they made them feel uncomfortable, especially on the local level where people knew each other very well. And it was more and more difficult for the Soviet regime to recruit the future collaborators, because people who thought about joining this path, they now had to be in mind that they would pay a big price for that, a bigger publicity for that. And last but not least, the Soviet authorities took all their resources in order to suppress the Catholic resistance, and due to that, they were compelled to diminish their attention to other forms of society's defiance, maybe not so open forms, for example, for example, growing an ethnocultural movement in Soviet Lithuania, or, for example, to broaden frames of creative freedom for intellectuals, for artists, because maybe the biggest problem for the Soviet regime was to isolate intellectuals from the and underground, especially from the Catholic underground, and they try to do it. And in conclusion, I would say that this success story of the Chronicle is probably the first victory of Lithuanians in 20th century in the field of information warfare, because, as it was already mentioned, the Chronicle managed to attract the attention not only of Western media, but also of political establishment, especially in the USA. And the Chronicle already in 80s was visible on the Western public space. And it was a reliable source of information about what is going on in Lithuania. And maybe, in my view, a lesson for the present we can take from the history of the Chronicle is the consistent commitment to the truth that matters. Language of the facts was the basic principle of Chronicle, and the editors of the Chronicle, with the help of this principle, effectively questioned the Soviet authorities. And a week ago, I had a discussion with the chief editor of the Chronicle, Cardinal Tamkevičius, and I have asked him, were there any cases during the history of the Chronicle that facts mentioned in the Chronicle would appear later as fake news, not reliable facts. And he answered that there were no such cases, and in spite of efforts of Soviet authorities to provoke, in this regard, editors of Chronicle, they managed to escape such cases, and it is incredibly good result, I think. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Streikas. And your comments about the Chronicle being the first victory for Lithuania in the field of information warfare is a good segue to our next speaker, who will focus on the challenges facing democracies that are under assault by disinformation. Donatas Huslis is head of the Media and Democracy program at the Vilnius Institute of Policy Analysis.
Thank you very much. Hello there, Jerry, everyone. I'm very honored to be among such a distinguished speakers, and I would like to start from my personal remark, because most probably because of such a people as Cardinal Tamkevičius and others who were really committed to seeking truth in those hard, dark times. I'm, as a representative of this younger generation of Lithuanians, spent only 5 years in the Soviet Union, and afterwards I lived in a free and independent Lithuania. And today in my speech, I would like to speak more about, as it was mentioned, about the challenges of disinformation to democracies. But I also would like to start from the lesson that for me is really important from the times of Chronicle. Because for me, the example of Chronicle demonstrates that free society is not only about institutions and their arrangement, but it's also a moral achievement, and it is impossible without the people who are committed to seek truth and are prepared to risk for it. which means democracy is not about only institutions, it's about our personal responsibilities. And in democracies, as citizens, we make decisions, and we make decisions based on the evaluation of the facts. Therefore, the need to have truthful, verified information is of vital importance for the survival of free societies and democracy. And today we are witnessing how Kremlin weaponizes this information and uses it as a gun pointed at our free societies to weaken and ultimately destroy them. Of course, today all of our eyes are turned to Ukraine, and we are witnessing Kremlin's war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. And we must keep in mind that although disinformation does not kill physically, as do the Russia's shells directed to the Ukrainian cities, it played its part in the preparation for this war. For years and years, Ukrainians were portrayed as Nazis, Banderovцы, by the Kremlin media. Their right to statehood and sovereignty was questioned, and not only by Putin and his Siloviki, this junta of his closest politicians, but also by some academicians who granted their names to spread this disinformation about Ukraine and so on. And this kind of disinformation had two target audiences. First of all, of course, local audience in Russia to justify the aggression and dehumanize Ukrainians. This is how the way for the war was prepared. And of course, then international audience in hope that at the right moment, influenced by the disinformation, this international audience will not extend help, or will do it with the reluctance and much later to Ukraine. Of course, now the situation is different. Majority of the West are now united and committed to help Ukraine. So Kremlin is adopting its tactics and its disinformation targets. It tries now to target international audience, trying to warn them that the help to Ukraine and standing against Russia will be costly and have dire economic or even military consequences. So if you cannot persuade, then you resort to frightening. And this is the Kremlin's disinformation playbook. Kremlin wants now to make us afraid. Therefore, we need to remember the words of St. John Paul II, which said, "Be not afraid," and speak truth. And I would also like to say, which I think is really important in today's circumstances, is that Kremlin weaponizes disinformation not only to disguise facts, which are uncomfortable, but it also aims to strike at our core values, which constitute free society. For example, we can now witness various attempts. Of course, many of them are on social networks and on the fringe websites. In Lithuania, luckily, we have all the major Kremlin's disinformation channels blocked. And finally, this decision was taken because they are not media representatives. They are the hand of the state, the weapon of a state, which weaponizes information for the malign aims. And for example, today we are witnessing various tactics how to sow divisions and mistrust during the crisis in Ukraine. Now we see attempts which try to portray help to Ukrainian refugees as a sign that someone, the state or your neighbor, does not care about its own people, or it tries to promote a view that encourages people to abandon solidarity with the suffering, persecuted, because this will be economically costly. So it is better not to be a good Samaritan who takes care of the person lying beaten on the way, but to pass him by just because of your personal interest. Of course, as I mentioned before, all these military threats are instigated. And of course, when I speak that disinformation targets not only facts but values, the main aims, main goals of this disinformation is to destroy civic dialogue and instead to promote polarization, instead of interpersonal trust, promote mutual animosity. And it also, now we are clearly witnessing trying to weaponize even religion and turn it from the love thy neighbor into hate your neighbor. So the ultimate end, I have to summarize, is to use these disinformation campaigns in order to promote a change in society's attitudes and values. Therefore, in this context, it is important to remember not only what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for. And I think this is also one of the lessons of the Chronicle, because they always knew that they are not just fighting against those who are lying, who are persecuting the church. They are fighting for values, for the truth, for the good of the people, for the rights of the believers, for the rights of all the people. And in this case, when we are fighting, when we are answering to disinformation, we have to ask ourselves what kind of values we want to embody and defend. It is important to analyze how do we answer to disinformation, and it is not enough just to debunk disinformation. Although I should say it is an important task. Disinformation, when it is most effective, targets our vulnerable spots. It exploits our problems. Therefore, if we want to do some preventive work, not just post factum work when we run and we debunk disinformation which is already spreading, we need to address these problems which disinformation tries to exaggerate, which tries to deepen, and it can be poverty, discrimination, lack of prospects, atomization, polarization, and many different things. But most of the times when disinformation is successful, it does not create problems. It exploits problems that are already existing. So preventive work is addressing those problems. And what is very important while fighting disinformation, I think, and it's also one of the lessons from the past, is that we should strive not to become like the enemy. What I mean by this, for example, Kremlin's disinformation likes to exploit collective stereotypes, cliches, collective blame, and guilt. They are Nazis, they are Banderovцы, they are all Russophobes. We keep on hearing such statements from various Kremlin outlets and etc. But if we answer like this, we would be playing Putin's hand if we would attach blame and guilt to a person just because he or she is a Russian, despite the position he or she holds, which means we have to avoid these collective stereotypes, collective cliches, collective blame, collective guilt, and actually see a person with his own unique position and so on, and do not say that, as we are answering the Kremlin's disinformation, we are fighting all the Russians. No, because if we would do this, then we would also destroy all the bridges that can still connect us to this society. We would distance ourselves from the ones who are opposing the Kremlin's regime, and I would say we also not just can, but also must help them in the ways we can. So I think I do not want to make some kind of overwhelming conclusions because disinformation, the poet, the Nobel Prize literary winner, Czesław Miłosz, in his famous poem, The Child of Europe, he said very important words, that truth is always more difficult, it has more layers, and lie, it's always more simply. It tries to present the world in a black and white. So we have to resist this kind of simplified reality and see it in all the colors. And of course, while fighting this disinformation, not to become like an enemy, but also work and do our homeworks at home to attend those problems, to attend these wounds that disinformation is exploiting. And only then we can say that we can be successful, not only when we introduce informational literacy, media literacy, not only when we have strong fact-checking tools, when we have strong media. All this is necessary, of course, but we should address these problems, and then we can do some preventive work in order not to allow these problems to be weaponized by the Kremlin's disinformation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Prisleys. You're connecting the important role of the Chronicle in truth-telling to the challenges that we face today in dealing with the disinformation is really helpful. Our final presenter is Professor Raenya Vaishfelite, who is professor of Church and Art History at the University of Vilnius. She will address how the Chronicle became an important part of the wider Soviet human rights movement.
Thank you very much. Thank you for invitation to this discussion, to this panel. And I will try to be short, brief, and sorry, but because Donatas Puslis addressed some issues related to human rights and information. But what I would like to underline from what we already were talking about, Chronicle of Catholic Church in Lithuania, that it is important to defense of freedom of religion as integral part of movement for human rights in Soviet Union. Chronicle of Catholic Church itself as underground edition dedicated to rights of believers and to religious freedom was actually inspired by a bulletin that was called Chronicle of Current Events. This bulletin that was published since 1968 was dedicated to human rights violation in Soviet Union. Archbishop Grušas mentioned initiators of the Chronicle of Catholic Church. It was so, but there was kind of not just example, but also context, because defenders of rights of believers and of religious freedom in Lithuania had a strong help and support of human rights activists in Moscow and in some other Soviet republics of Soviet Union. Once Chronicles was began to be published, exactly the moving it abroad, giving it possibility to be distributed, was made possible by, for example, Sergei Kovalyov, a human rights defender, Russian, who was actually arrested because the Chronicle was found in his apartment by the KGB search in Moscow. And actually Kovalyov was persecuted in Lithuania. So after his imprisonment, his colleagues, human rights defenders in Moscow, including, and actually he was very instrumental also during, and Andrei Sakharov was helping through their contacts, Moscow was much more open city that was Vilnius or Lithuania itself. Access to Lithuania actually was very restricted. So was helping Chronicle to reach West. Would be that Chronicle was sent through Italy, into United States in various ways. Quite few copies were being sent through different persons who were traveling and so on. So human rights were very important chapter of Helsinki agreements of 1975. And was one of international agreements that Holy See diplomacy took active part in it, as we know. And it's important to underline that Helsinki committees that were created in Soviet Union after, to promote human rights and freedom in Soviet Union. So Lithuanian Helsinki Committee was second Helsinki Committee in Soviet Union, created after Muscovite Human Rights Committee, Helsinki Committee, and with help of Moscow Committee. Actually, Lithuanian Helsinki Committee was introduced in Moscow by the help of Moscow Committee, and those were there that invited foreign ambassadors or just ambassadors that were present in Moscow and foreign journalists. By that, and Helsinki committees, they were in that area of, I would say, half legal. They were not immediately persecuted. And it's interesting that in Lithuanian Helsinki Committee that consisted of 5 persons, 2 were Catholics, Catholic priest, Karolis Garutskas, and very active layman, Catholic layman, Viktoras Petkus. Since members of Lithuanian Helsinki group were regularly arrested and were sentenced to various terms of imprisonment for their single activities, not just as Helsinki Committee members, new members were recruited from other organizations, and one of the main organizations that were providing members for Helsinki Committee, Lithuanian Helsinki Committee, was also half legal Committee for Defense of Rights of Believers, Catholic, I would say. It was founded in 1978, and it was in close contact with Christian Committee for Rights of Believers, founded by Orthodox priest Gleb Yakunin in Moscow. So, if putting, let's say, what Chronicle was doing and what defenders of religious freedom and rights of believers were doing, it was, I would say, partially legitimized international communication on human rights issues inside and outside of SSR. It included religious freedom into international agenda of West and took it out of purely religious circles that quite often were considered liminal in certain Western countries. Upsurge of international interest in human rights situation in Soviet Union provoked reaction of Soviet government. And here's another thing I would like to tackle very briefly. Soviet government very early in late 70s started working on undermining human rights in international arena. First of all, in United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva. There was a group of Soviet lawyers that created concept of traditional values as opposition to human rights. At the beginning, this concept was used to attract support in voting in Geneva, support in Geneva of regimes that had problems and serious issues with human rights. But by the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was for a while forgotten. Soviet Union disappeared. Russia at the beginning was, actually very much in favor of human rights. But the beginning of Putin era, the concept of traditional values was resurrected, turned into doctrine, widely publicized in Russia, actually almost included in its constitution, and then widely used to attract various churches and religions to support Russia and later China in human rights in every area where human rights were evoked. I was Lithuania's representative at UNESCO for 3 years, and I witnessed that every document that mentions human rights was inevitably opposed by Russia, and this opposition sustained by China, Venezuela, some African states. And it's another paradox that Catholic Church, who used human rights to defend religious freedom and rights of believers, was very eagerly and very systematically approached. And here I really refer to what Donatas Puslis was talking about, disinformation, propaganda, manipulation, and everything. Catholic Church and other, of course, churches, but was eagerly approached by Russian Orthodox Church and by Russian state agencies, and their campaign for last more than 10 years against human rights. So I would be happy to answer questions or participate in discussion, but here I stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have some number of questions have come in, and so let me try to bring some of them together into shorter questions, and we have about 10 minutes left. So why don't I start with a couple questions that want a little bit more information about the Catholic movement and the Chronicle. One is, how is it possible for this publication to survive under such intensive KGB surveillance, the arrest of its editors and contributors and the like? Did it receive, what kind of support did it receive from, say, the institutional Catholic Church in Lithuania? And some of you have mentioned the support it's received from other human rights groups and from those abroad. And why did it cease publication if its work on exposing the truth and exposing disinformation is so important? Why did it not continue? And finally, the last question related to this is, was the Chronicle really, the people behind the Chronicle motivated mostly by religious and moral sensibilities, or was it political resistance to the Soviet Union, or what was the kind of balance between the religious, moral, political motivations behind the Chronicle and the Catholic defense of human rights? And I'll just open that up to all of you, because all of you have commented in one way or another on the Chronicle and its history. Who would like to jump in?
I will then. I think that if we take a look at the religious background, to answer, first of all, the question, how did they not get shut down? In one sense, I think by the grace of God, but they had a very decentralized way of collecting the information. They had a small groups or cells that were organized, and they were prepared because Tamkevičius was arrested, and they thought they would shut it down by arresting the editor. And they had another priest who was ready to take over. He's now a retired bishop, Bishop Boruta. And these groups of cells, we have to remember also that religious sisters there were no religious communities that were allowed. So they were already acting, let's say, underground in that sense. They were called underground seminaries as well, where the priests were prepared outside of the normal structures. And that should answer your question with regard to the support from the church. They had a few bishops who were supportive and with whom they opened up and asked for permissions, but not all of those who were in charge of dioceses were involved. So there was that working together, and I think it was a balance between the grace of God and also some keen planning and preparation. I'll let somebody else pop in.
If I may, I would continue that story about success of Chronicle with another point, that it was really based on quite broad, I would say, infrastructure of underground, because in other cases when we have groups of human rights defenders, we talk about a very small and close group of people, and in this case we have a very broad underground with almost 1,000 of women acting in underground as nuns, and who were maybe most instrumental in continuing of Chronicle and collecting information and disseminating Chronicle and so on. What regards about the relationship between religious content and human rights issues in the Chronicle, I think one of the main reasons behind the success of Catholic resistance generally in Lithuania is that it resonated quite well with the Western global mainstream at that time. I mean, this general actualization of human rights, empowerment of social groups which were marginalized until then, and so on. And believers in the Soviet system were, of course, the most marginalized group, and this actualization of religious freedom was very successful, and as Raenya already mentioned, it was even on the global scale a new thing, this actualization of religious freedom and believers' rights, and it's maybe one of the achievements of Lithuanian resistance. I would say, I would agree.
Professor Vaishfelite, you mentioned that there's been, over the last 10 years, a lot of pressure on the Catholic Church in Lithuania to not support human rights, to embrace more of the, if you call it the Putin agenda. I'll put my words, not your words. Could you say a little bit more about that, and could others comment on the current role of the Catholic Church in Lithuania in promoting human rights and addressing the aggression against Ukraine and similar kinds of issues?
Thank you very much. It's a good question, but when I spoke about pressure, I didn't mean Lithuania or Lithuanian Church specifically. It was all Catholic Church. First of all, I witnessed it because I represented Lithuania to Holy See for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, and as we know, 2014 happened in that arch of time. It was very active diplomatic activity, very strong diplomatic activity of Orthodox Church of Russia and of Russian diplomacy. If you look in those dates, we have Putin seeing Pope Francis twice. You see a meeting with Cyril, and it was also, what Russia allowed for once. But it was, there would be no week that somebody, the state diplomacy or church diplomacy would be in Vatican, would be visiting major archdioceses of Italy, would going to other places. And Ilarion, let's say, state secretary of Russian church, was giving talks about European Union as authoritarian state that goes to destroy religion in Naples at archdiocese, to seminarians and so on. That's what I mean. It was international action. And I think every Catholic church in one or another way, National Catholic Church, was approached by it. And only now, with what time actually, again, there's, yes, truth will set us free, but there's also, the time revealing truth, old metaphor and old iconographic image. The time reveals the truth. Now we're seeing actually, in large way, what it was about. So that's.
Archbishop, we're almost out of time. Can I give you the last word on the role of the church today in addressing human rights questions and the war in Ukraine, things like that?
I think there have been various letters that have been written by my brother bishops' conferences from around Europe to Kirill as well, imploring him to really take a stand to stop the war. It's obviously not been effective in that sense. What I met with the ambassadors to the Holy See of the European Union about a month ago, one of the things that I told them is the importance to really listen to the people who have a direct experience of being under Russia or working with Russia and who know the culture. We were called Russophobes until very recently when Russia invaded Ukraine, and many countries realized that we might have something here. We might know what we're talking about. And with Russia, it's very, very clear, the mentality. The image of the bear is not lost here. If a bear is coming at you and you slowly start backing up, it's going to keep going at you and attack you. If you are able to bop it on the nose or use one of those little fireballs, and it feels that you're going to stand up to it, it turns and runs. We have the same situation here. The church is, and I think the church leaders, the bishops of the various bishops' conferences in Europe for sure, one is the use of prayer, for peace, but two is getting the truth out. And I'm very pleased with the nuncio in the Ukraine right now, who's a Lithuanian, who started there just before the major war. He's one of the few ambassadors who has stayed in Kiev through the whole period. And he does see that spiritual element of this fight. And he is supporting the Ukrainians in their war to maintain their independence.
Are there any last comments from any of our panelists? Well, thank you, Archbishop. Thank you, all of the panelists, for being with us. We have just touched the surface of a really important topic. These are very dark days in many ways, but the story of the Chronicle and the Catholic resistance to Soviet repression should give us hope that even in the darkest days, amazing things are possible. So thank you for joining us. All of you are out in the audience. Again, thank you to our speakers and to